Welcome to the Writer Reads The Reptile's Blade, Part 4. But that's not all you've come to ask, is it? She asked. No, you were given a gift, and I do not mean one of inheritance. Felix waited. She knew what gift he was talking about, was intensely grateful that the feeds were temporarily offline. There were only two others who knew of that gift. She'd kept it a secret, just as she'd promised. There were words that had to be said before she revealed her knowledge. My grandfather survived. Whatever else Micah might have said was lost in the thunderous knocking on her door. Felix glanced in surprise at the lizardine warrior, just in time to see him fade. She heard the faint click of her door locks releasing, but it came at the same time as her door gave a tortured creak and then cracked around the handle, bursting inwards to allow two security guards to come hurtling into the room, their weapon muzzles searching the corners, the walls, and the ceiling for an intruder. The tinted visors covering their eyes usually all it took to reveal a lizardine suit in blend mode. "What is going on?" Felix demanded, rising from behind her desk. "Sit down, ma'am. Sit down!" Both guns were pointed at her. "Ma'am, I must insist that you sit." Felix stared at them, but raised her hands and sat. She watched as they went through her office, searching it with care, noticed that Micah had placed his cup of half-drunk tea on the other side of her desk. Felix reached across and picked it up. She was still holding it when the guards came out of her bathroom. One frowned as he glanced in her direction, and Felix raised the cup to her lips, absent-mindedly sipping its contents while she waited for them to be done. When they had gone over every inch of her office and ensuite, the two guards raised their visors and walked back to the door. One of them spared her a glance before departing. "Thank you, ma'am. We apologize for any inconvenience." Felix lowered the cup. "No problem," she replied, and wondered who else might be coming to visit. She had heard the guards reporting to another person out in reception, and it hadn't been Manx Carlyle. Indeed, her assistant appeared in the doorway next, studiously ignoring the damaged door as he came and gathered up the teapot and tray. "Ma'am, may I?" he asked, indicating the cup in her hand, and that was when the enormity of what she had done struck her. She had shared a cup with a high-born lizardine warrior, diplomat, counsellor, and lord. That had shades of meaning she'd completely forgotten when she'd raised the cup to her lips and taken her first sip. Oh, hell! "Ma'am?" It would be a deadly insult for her to hand the cup to another male so soon after drinking from it. Deadly. And she was growing fond of Carlyle. "I'm not done yet, Carlyle." "But, ma'am, you have a guest." You have no idea, she thought. "Then bring an extra cup and a fresh pot," she snapped. "This one stays with me." Carlyle tightened his lips in disapproval. "Guests should be served first, ma'am," he said, his tone strained. Felix wanted to say that the only guest that mattered had been served first, and that she was now rightly, and possibly royally, screwed. She looked steadily at him as she raised the cup and took another deliberate sip. Carlyle hovered, obviously hoping she would change her mind. He left only when another figure filled the doorway. Felix almost dropped the cup in surprise. "Ah, Minister," Carlyle said in his best aide-de-camp voice, "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. I'm afraid the captain is still feeling a little under the weather." It was clear from the quizzical look on the minister's face and the slightly uplifted eyebrow that her boss didn't believe a word Carlyle had said. He came straight to the point. "Sensors registered a lizardine life form in your office, Captain. A full-blooded lizardine. Any explanation as to why that might be?" Felix greeted him with a look of pure feigned innocence. Keeping the teacup held at chest height, she refrained from demanding to know why such sensors had been installed in her office without her knowledge, and replied, "Because the sensors are on the blink, sir?" The minister was not amused. He returned her look with an expression so stern that Felix no longer had a hard time keeping a straight face. "That would be a first," he said, "but whether or not you say they're working is beside the point, And if your office is so empty, who is that? Felix glanced in the direction he was pointing, but saw nothing and nobody standing in front of the bookshelf he indicated. I'm sorry, sir, but I can't see anything. He might not believe the senses were playing up, but he could do nothing without proof. The minister waited, staring at her as though she ought to know what he wanted. In truth, Felix did, but revealing Micah's presence was not on the cards until the lizardine warrior chose to make himself known. And that, patently, wasn't now. She hoped Micah knew what he was doing. Look, sir, you know I would tell you if I saw the one that got away from the Institute, but he didn't hang around and he didn't show an interest in talking. I know we can't afford another incident, and that display they put on was bad enough that I can't think of how we're going to regain the ground they lost us. She was still holding the teacup in her hands when her aide knocked quietly at the door. Motioning for him to enter, she realized she was holding what they were looking for in her hands. It wasn't hard to put an edge of desperation in her voice. But, sir, there's a reason he wasn't armed. Maybe they were sending him to negotiate. And if that's the case, sir, why would I be hiding him in my office? The minister hadn't reached his position by being anybody's fool. He glanced at the cup Felix held, as though it suddenly meant something. Captain, the lab won't tell me there's lizardine DNA on the cup, will they? Felix wanted to ask why on earth he'd sent her best china to the lab. What she managed was a very bitter, only mine, sir, which seemed to satisfy him. Very good. He turned to Carlyle. If you would do the honours, Lieutenant. Carlyle poured, refilling Felix's cup as part of his duties. The minister stayed a little longer, asking about the incident at the Institute, and then questioning her over her relapse in the car. By the end of it, Felix was gripping her cup so tightly she was surprised it hadn't shattered. When he seemed to run out of questions, the minister rose and set his cup on her desk. Go home, Captain, he said, and there was a gentleness in his voice that hadn't been there before. But my report, Felix protested. You just gave it, he told her. No need to type it up. I'll have my secretary transcribe it later this afternoon. He'll send you a copy in the morning and you can sign off on it if you agree. Felix rose with him, walking him to the door without realizing she carried her cup with her. Good afternoon, Minister, she said, and he shook her hand before walking away. I'll have the car ready to meet you, Carlyle said, but Felix shook her head. Ma'am, you can't walk after today. Medical and security will both have pink kittens, Felix finished for him, then softened her voice. If you don't mind, Carlyle, I'll take a cab. Thank you. She stood in the open doorway, listening as Carlyle called the cab company and gave the address for pick-up and drop-off. Then she went back to the office and cleaned her teeth before going home. I'll see you in the morning, Manx. Felix felt Micah pass her in the corridor, but didn't panic. She knew him now, had his scent, the taste of his presence, had shared a cup with him in a time-honoured tradition that intensified her own innate abilities to a point where accuracy was no longer a problem and identifying him was guaranteed. She thought she sensed others, and that made sense, and no sense at all. If Micah had come with an escort, why hadn't they prevented his capture? And why were they hanging back, even now? She ran her pass over the scanner on the way out, waving goodbye to the guard as she left. She did not worry when Micah's presence was no longer a tangible thing. He now knew her address and would meet her at the apartment. Knowing him, he would probably be inside when she got there. Felix tried to stifle the brief spike of annoyance she felt, and to tamp down the nervous anticipation rolling in her gut. She wasn't looking forward to the evening ahead, but it could mean gaining ground in the negotiations. Her race depended on it, just as Micah had said. How then could any gift, even the elder's sword, be more important than that? She let the cab take her home, fighting all the way not to let memory take her under, aware, just the same, of a subtle lizardine presence, something close by and yet just out of reach. If she hadn't known Micah wasn't there to start a guerrilla war, that niggling something might have caused her more concern. Micah slipped through her apartment door as soon as she unlocked it. He had at least done her the courtesy of leaving the door on its hinges and not offending the body corporate with more destruction than necessary. "They will ask me to hunt you," she said, as they walked inside together, she as tangible as the day, and he as invisible as any ghost. He dropped the blend as soon as the door had closed behind her. "How do you know it's safe?" Felix asked. Micah let his jaw relax into a smile. "I know." Satisfying herself with a mere frown at his reluctance to share, Felix went into the kitchen. "Are you hungry?"